narcotics. They call them self-propelled semi-submersibles from Africa into Spain, because basically they'll take the cocaine, traffic it across the South Atlantic, get into Africa, drive, you know, move it by land north to the Mediterranean, cross it over, and the Spanish National Police were discovered one of these one day as it was GPS activated. And it turns out that there's a specialty cartel. And cartel is a kind of a loose term of art now to talk about a criminal gang of some variety or another that builds these semi-submersible, semi-autonomous narco subs. They're not actually submarines, but builds them for the drug trafficking organizations to bring them into Europe. And keep in mind that European drug market is roughly the same size as the American drug market. So we're talking billions of dollars of product moving across. And in more recent time, we're starting to see these semi-submersible narco subs not only crossing the Atlantic, they're now starting to cross the Pacific, moving drugs from South America, Latin America, into the Pacific Islands, and to another large market, Australia. So truly, we talk about drones in general. We often think of small UAS, and we'll talk more about those. But we're really looking at what I would call, and the U.S. government has termed, UXS, or a range of uncrewed vessels or vehicles. Some maritime, it could be either submarines or surface vessels, some aerial, when you think of a small UAS, and some ground vehicles. And the ground vehicles we see really being used in the Ukrainian theater of conflict. Actually, we see all three varieties being used there, but ground vehicles haven't become a major consideration in the civil environment yet. But as industry starts using these robotic and autonomous systems for commerce, we may start to see them come there. So earlier we're talking about how drug cartels might use small UAS to interact with U.S. Police and military forces. I would say that's a potential. They haven't done so yet. They primarily goal is to make money, and interfering with the cops and the military gets in the way of doing that. But what I would say more important than that is thinking that it's not just going to become aerial, variety. It can be all
variety. Aquatic or boats, or even maybe those Boston Robotic kind of style dogs. I've seen a lot of those.
And if you think of it, there's commercial. The other variation, just briefly, maybe come back to that, is swarms, or 3+ more drones. And keep in mind, you can buy a commercial controller for using drones right now, up to 12 you could drive on your iPhone, right?
Oh, wow.
You can, if you look at some of the light shows that have been done, for example, at the Chinese Olympics and things, you can have hundreds of drones, and you could start talking about heterogeneous swarms. So they're not all just attack drones. Some are command and control drones. Some are reconnaissance drones, or ISR, intelligence surveillance reconnaissance drones, and on and on. And some could be surface, some could be ground, some could be aerial. Now, if you look at the ground side, I was in Dublin a few weeks ago, and I saw a small robot delivering pizza. Pizza is a cool thing to deliver, but you could also, conceptually deliver a small improvised explosive device. So we're certainly on the cusp of some very interesting things. The interesting thing with that semi-submersible narco sub I mentioned, it was semi-autonomous. We're starting to see drug cartels and other transnational organized crime groups like the 'Ndrangheta, which is a Calabrian mafia, which is a big player in the global illicit economy, starting to see them experiment with artificial intelligence to enhance their operations. And it's more than just a chat GPT, generative AI stuff, which could conceivably use for mission planning and reconnaissance and trying to figure out where you're going to do stuff could eventually become, for both us, our military adversaries, and our non-state challengers, could become tools in a playground. So it's almost as if we're opening a dystopian science fiction novel, or watching a Andor or something like that.
You had mentioned earlier about how the cartels primarily are operating within Mexico right now. Is they might go use drones along the border for surveillance, but maybe use proxies in the United States for delivering contraband. But currently, they've not at least used any kind of lethal drone weaponry in the United States. I know recently the administration has been talking about utilizing the military more actively to go after the cartels. I know your background; you have a lot of experience with researching cartels and interacting with them. What's your could there potentially be a risk of the cartels starting to use drones, more the lethal type of drones, inside the United States, or to attack border guards? Or I guess that's always a risk, but do you think that could heighten that?
That's always a risk, but it may be counterproductive for their true goal. Remember, cartels' purpose is to make money. They're business enterprise. Now, there's three things that cartels can do when they address the state, and we could get into the deeper theories, but they can basically avoid the police, elude the police, and that's what most criminals do. They don't want to contact the police. If that doesn't work, they try to co-opt the police. They corrupt the police. They bribe the police. When that fails, then they directly engage or confront the police, right? And what we've seen in Mexico, all three of those are in play. In the United States, it's primarily elude, avoid. There's some degree of corruption. I mean, every once in a while, you will see a border patrol official, a local sheriff, even my old department, I see deputy sheriffs transporting narcotic contraband into the LA County jail on behalf of an organized crime group. And
especially, it seems like corrections, there's a lot of infiltration, or there can be both from the air, and then also the guards can be a little
well, yeah, and that's universal, right? And that's everywhere. I mean, I can remember looking at Papillon, the movie, back in the day, and looking how people would smuggle narcotics into Devil's Island, which was probably one of the most secure prisons on the planet. People have always moved things in. Prisons directly play many roles in organized crime groups. Some organized crime groups actually are founded inside prisons. Think of the Mexican mafia in the United States, and there are other prison gangs in the United States, like Barrio Azteca in Texas is one other example. Look at the prison gangs in Brazil, the First Capital Command, or Primeiro Comando da Capital, which is the PCC, and their rival, the Comando Vermelho, or the Red Command. Both of those are start as prison gangs and conduct terrorist attacks in the street. And by the way, and I'll circle from this back to the Mexican cartel use of drones, the PCC in Brazil uses drones to attack the police and conduct large infantry style bank robbery maneuvers in what they call the Novo Cangaçal, or the new Cangaçal, and the Cangaçal being a period of brigandage during the formation of the solidification of the Brazilian state. And you see similar brigandage occurring with Ned Kelly when Australia started to consolidate into a modern nation state. And certainly we have Bonnie and Clyde and other notable gangsters in our history. So that's not unheard of. So Brazilian gangs also use drones. Criminal enterprises in Ecuador use drones. The Mexican cartels, the book you showed up before, Criminal Drone Evolution, that my colleague Dr. Robert Bunker and myself published in 2021, draws on material going back to some of our initial explorations of the potential organized crime use of drones, going back to 2014. We documented one of the first attacks in Mexico in 2017. with cartels using small drones and actually interacting with the FARC, the Colombian guerrilla organization, to get tradecraft on how to build small explosives. And then they were using those to weaponize the drones, which until that point and were primarily used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So if you think across the border, the cartels would, fly a drone, see where the border patrol or Customs and Border Protection or other law enforcement is, and avoid them. Right? Remember, they don't want to get caught. That gets in the way of business. Over time, they start to do the same in Mexico. Over time, they start to use drones, and we see in the late 2015, 2016, 2017 period, you start to see the cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or the CJNG, rise in stature, and they're battling in Guanajuato against another cartel, which is primarily an oil theft enterprise, a bunch of Huachicoleros called the Cartel Santa Rosa de Lima, and they start using drones to attack each other. Over time, they start to weaponize the drones. Then the real evolution in Mexican drug cartel drone weaponization is using the weaponized drones together with what they call narco tanques, or monstros. There's another big. They're basically artisanal armored vehicles, infantry, improvised armored fighting vehicles, or improvised infantry fighting vehicles, and they have these mass military style maneuvers in the hinterland of Mexico, and they're battling with their narco tanks on the ground, using landmines, digging trenches to canalize the response, and then flying drones above for not only to get the first person view to see what's happening, but to actually drop improvised explosives. So we call them like improvised aerial explosive devices on top of their rival cartels, the police and the military. So the Mexican cartels have been using drones, small UAS, to attack police and the military. One of the first precursors we saw was in Mexicali, right in Baja California. The cartel, and we believe it was an affiliate of the CJNG, flying a drone into the home of the Baja State Public Safety Director with a couple of inert grenades on it and a threat communication saying, "Leave us alone or the next one will be real," basically. Over time, they've become more common. Now, the Mexican cartels generally avoid confronting U.S. police, mostly because U.S. police are less corrupt, more proficient, and more professional than many of the Mexican police. Not that there aren't professional police in Mexico, there are, but there are also a high degree of police corruption in Mexico. So they don't like to confront us because they don't own us. So when my colleague George Davis, who's the president of Synthetic Decision Group, and I did a study at the port of Brownsville, and Brownsville is in South Texas, right on the Gulf, right across the border from right on the frontier. We see a large amount of cartel activity on the port of Brownsville. I found our study. Our study looks at drones and port security at the port of Brownsville, and we saw that the drones were coming at a higher level of activity than most people anticipated. We used publicly available information from Customs and Border Protection to look at what was happening, and we tracked the drones. Now, most of the drones we tracked were DJI drones, and most of the drones that we see in irritants, because most of the drone activity in the United States are just irritants, or the DJI drones, because they're small, they're financially accessible. But we noticed there they were loitering across the ship dismantling. They dismantle aircraft carriers there, and that led us to think there may be a counterintelligence concern there. Maybe somebody, maybe a foreign state actor, might be interested in how we construct aircraft carriers, should they want to. and I'll leave people's imagination to bring them where that does. And then we also saw they were watering over the oil transport area. Now, there's a significant cross-border uh, trade in illicit hydrocarbons. They basically, there's been prosecutions in the federal courts in Houston where some of the cartels, the Gulf cartel comes to mind historically. The Zetas were engaged in that. Would they do these illicit taps? They tap the Mexican pipelines, then they will transport the product here to the United States. They'll often adulterate the oil, with naphtha, so it burns, but it's not burned well. They'll sell it back to Mexico, which has a national oil company, Pemex, but there's also some commercial oil now in Mexico as well. And there's been a high degree of corruption within Pemex, so that's become a cross-border trade, but kind of endemic throughout Mexico, and not just on the border. You see in Baja and other places. Guanajuato, very heavy activity. Organized crime does the same thing in Brazil. They certainly do the same things in Venezuela. So, so you see drones come to play. In this case, they're for the surveillance, and many of those may have just been irritants. So most of what we see in the U.S. aren't cartels, although there's this latent potential they may go that way. Most of what we see in the U.S. are just irritants. And as we were talking earlier, some may think this is brand new. I think it's not new. It's just being recognized now, because the first time I knew of a drone incursion interfering with wildland fire operations was back in about 2009, 2010, when I was still the tactical planning lieutenant for the LA County Sheriff's Department Emergency Operations Bureau. And I don't want to say some joker, but that's the first thing that comes to mind. Some ill-informed citizen flies a drone and interferes with an airborne firefighting asset. And that's going back to that period of time. And the question then we had was, what do we do about that? Right. And the first thing everybody thinks is, we'll shoot it down. Well, that's a really, really bad idea for a whole bunch of reasons. One is, with some of the newer drones, you couldn't be fast enough. Second, it's against the law because they're aircraft.
We
Third,
talk a lot about that. The FAA, can't mess with any aircraft. So that's definitely a conversation I think we're still having. What do you do about that?
And need to, because look, what goes up comes down, right? I tell people, like, when I first when I was early in my career, we working patrol as a deputy sergeant lieutenant, you would always I always drew New Year's Eve for some reason, particularly early in the career. You don't get off the holidays, and right around that midnight hour, every cop in LA is advised to get underneath the freeway overpass. Why? Because people shoot celebratory gunfire into the air. Every one of those bullets comes down somewhere. So if you shoot it up in the air to try to take the drone down, it's going to come down somewhere, and it may come down on top of a person, and that's never going to be a good idea. But just on that, since August 6th of this year, there have been 28 reported drone incursions on wildfires in the U.S. 21 of those are in California, one in Florida, a couple in other places across the nation, Oklahoma, Arizona, New Mexico.
You also had the drone that ran into the the Texas search and rescue helicopter, doing conducting operations in that flood zone, those big floods that Texas had. So we've even seen a lot, not just them being nuisances, but also actually striking aircraft, because you also had the wildfire where the drone struck the Canadian Super Scooper plane during the LA wildfire. So it's kind of crossing the line from just being a few nuisances now to being a real risk for public safety.
It is a real risk for public safety, and there's a real question as to how do you deal with that. And we start to look at there's an awareness of threat. We've seen some people fly drones in over large sporting events. So how do you protect stadia? In fact, my colleague George Davis, myself, and an academic Nathan Jones at the Sam Houston State University, we did a series of 3 papers on drone threats against stadia or stadiums, depending upon which way you prefer to, do the plural of stadium. And in that study, we did an overview of what the threat picture looks like. And we used it as a proxy because there had not been a terrorist attack against, in the United States using a drone to that point. And there still hasn't, unless I've missed something. I haven't seen one. There's been a lot of concern. But we looked at what the general threat was. We looked at how the operational considerations. So we talked about what those mitigation options could be and the difficulty of doing that. And then the third was we looked at the technical integration, how you could take the different sensors together and put them in a package that could become operationally useful to mitigate the threat. So, I mean, if you take all that together to sum up just where we've been so far, the threat of drones, the awareness that that's there is growing. We see there's a growing threat vector to all sectors, and we're all concerned about the UAS, right? The small aerial drones, but they could start to be the weaponized drones we've seen used in Mexico and Brazil. We see a whole range of non-state actors potentially available, going from street gangs or street prison gang complexes like the gangs in Brazil to Mexican cartels. And they certainly, if they know how to use them in Mexico, they know how to use them here. The CJNG, which is one of the main proliferators of drone technology in Mexico, certainly has the capacity to operate in the United States. The Sinaloa cartel also has drone experience, and they're fragmenting. And when groups fragment, they tend to be more violent. Could a direct action against them by U.S. forces trigger their reaction? Potentially. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I know that targeting cartel forces in Mexico is problematic for a number of reasons. But there's legal considerations to come to play if the Mexican government doesn't give us permission. That likely violates international law, unless there is an imminent need for self-defense. But some of the rationale that's been used to do that thus far, saying there's, for example, an invasion, has not been accepted, by a court yet, and doesn't meet the traditional definitions. So that, I don't know where that will go, but that's problematic. But terrorists are becoming more aware of guerrillas, like, are becoming more aware, like the FARC guerrillas are aware of using drones. We've seen drones being used in Colombia now. And Colombia is a long-standing conflict, but one of the byproducts of that conflict was the fact that when there was peace initiatives and they started to demobilize some of the guerrilla fighters from the FARC and the ELN, all those guys went to work for organized crime groups. Many of them went to go to work for organized crime groups in Brazil, and perhaps they brought that skill to the PCC. And they're certainly expanding that use in Brazil, expanding it to tri-border region where, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina come together, which is, kind of a seam. We know from you do military planning, you attack the seams. Well, the cartels have figured that out. They are certainly exploiting the vacuum of state authority in the Amazon, and there's a lot of contested area there. But those, former FARC guerrillas have gone to work for organized crime. They've also transported some of their skills and worked directly with Mexican cartels. And the Mexican cartels have lots of money. They have global presence. We talked earlier about the moving narco subs, moving narco product across the Atlantic, across the Pacific. You're seeing them, narco subs now in the Solomon Islands. You're seeing Mexican drug presence in Australia, cartel presence globally, links with other very sophisticated groups like the Drangheta, the Calabrian Mafia, links with the Sicilian Mafia, links with outlaw motorcycle gangsters. Gangsters are gangsters. When we first looked, Robert Bunker and I first looked at criminal activity in a tri-border region back in the late 90s, we called it the Star Wars bar of crime. And I think that, that vision still works. So between that, you see a whole range of actors. You see threat proliferation. mean, there's a belief that the Ukrainian conflict brought these skills to the cartels. We know that's not true because the current iteration of the Ukrainian conflict starts in February 2022. Our book documenting cartel evolution came out the year before. We see, the first documented attack we know about in Brazil in 2017, and we see stuff going back, to 2014 or so in Mexico. So it's not the proximate cause, but also, and there's current reporting that the cartels are sending people there to tactically experiment. And that's reasonable because all criminal groups become more sophisticated when they come in conflict with other criminal groups. And conflict is an area where criminal enterprises can make a lot of money, and the cartels already have a lot of money and they want more. We see that there's a risk to high-profile public gatherings, and it's not just stadia. It could be auto racing. It could be large parades. It could be, we already saw in 2018, 2 drones were used in an assassination attempt against the president of Venezuela, Maduro. That wasn't successful. We talked about the threat to a Mexican public safety official.
What was how did they conduct that attack, or what did that look like?
There were 2 small UAS. When he was speaking on a platform, they came in and they were rendered safe before they could detonate themselves on the president. But that's the first assassination attempt. Well, one of the first that's documented.
What did they do to mitigate them? Did they shoot them down, or they use a GPS jamming, or?
I think I'll have to pull the details out of shooting them down. Sounds more reasonable. I don't think there was a lot of jamming
High tech.
back at that point in time. Shooting down. I mean, and I have to verify, but that's the most likely. And shooting down it's not lawful here, and it's problematic should you get them. But those did not go off. He didn't kill him. Maduro's still alive, but certainly that shows that you could do that. There have been obviously continued exploration of drones of all types. Small UAS, larger UAS, loitering kamikaze drones,
or the ID drones.
The fiber optic drones you can't jam. And there's now what do you call it? The SLAM, that basically self recognizing mapping, automated mapping protocol. So AI is with computer vision able to navigate without GPS. So you can GPS jam now, but you can only jam a GPS driven drone. If it's not driven by GPS, if it's run by fiber optic, well, you can't jam that. You could cut the line, right? If it's going to be using its own, surveillance and automated mapping to figure out what's happening, you're not going to jam that because the computer is going to. It's seeing like we do, saying, "Oh, here we are," and just building its own point of reference as humans do. So.
That being said, I think one interesting area that we can zoom in a little bit is just looking at some of the documents that you pulled up. I know that there's a few. I don't want to say it's specific areas because obviously, I'm sure we can guess some of these ports or things, but it seems like there's a pretty significant risk that a cartel or a non-state actor could really cripple, especially LNG or chemical processing capacity in the United States, just by attacking some of these key waterways or ports along the Gulf. Like when you were looking at the port of Brownsville, like how big of a risk is there to kind of national security, and what are some of the ways that these ports are starting to look at mitigation or detection, or what's that look like?
Well, I think in general, as drones become more common and more available of all types, terrorists will look to use those. And as they see others use them, and there have been attacks of drone swarms against oil refineries. So it's not just ports and oil refineries in the Middle Eastern region, right? Saudi Arabia, right? And have the cartels seen that? Have other groups seen that? Of course, everybody watches the news. If you remember, before Dr. Noble created dynamite, your primary means of terrorist attack was walking up with a dagger and stabbing somebody, which still happens, right? And you still have low tech means where people can drive a vehicle into a crowd. That's another way of attacking a soft high density area. So will terrorists use drones? Yes. Will they target critical infrastructure if that's their objective, right? Because it all depends. It's not just capacity to do so, right? They it has to meet their objective at the period of time. So they may want to take out, for example, the police. You look at Aum Shinrikyo in 1995. They conducted Tokyo sarin attack. Well, they tried to use drones beforehand, but they didn't perfect the technique, right? They tried to do bio attacks. They didn't perfect that technique, so they went to building their own improvised sarin to conduct an attack at the train station to try to interfere with the prosecution of one of their leaders in a court, right? So there's a whole reason. So it's not just the capacity. Does it meet their objective? So I think they may do so. Oil infrastructure, because it's volatile, may be an area to attack. Public events, maybe if they want to hit economic stuff, you would attack the infrastructure. So that may fit certain types of group more than others. Like if you look who's been attacking the power infrastructure in the United States, it's been largely right-wing extremists. So you have to look at a whole range of things, but you could attack electric infrastructure this way. Drones could be used not only for attack, they could be used for extracting information, like getting close to an information system. People do like the remote scanning at a gas pump when you go to get your credit card at the gas pump and somebody steals your information that way. You could penetrate, depending upon the security of your system, some of the information. So they could be using them that way. They could be doing it for multiple things.
What are some of the ways that you've seen people mitigating drones, or on the mitigation side, or
mitigation is hard because mitigation is a whole range of steps that you can do lawfully. Right now in the United States, there are only 4 entities that can mitigate drones: the Department of Energy, which maintains the national nuclear stockpile and ships nuclear material from place to place; the Department of Justice, which has like the U.S. Marshal Service and the FBI as components; the Department of Homeland Security, which has the Secret Service and the Coast Guard, as components that you might look there, and then the Department of Defense, which obviously can use drones to mitigate their own facilities. Mitigation is everything when you look at the actual code, which interestingly, there's a operational legal lacuna or gap in the law. The laws that authorize the mitigation by the 4 civil agencies, I talk about, expired and have been pending legislative reauthorization, but have only been extended provisionally and through continuing resolutions, because the Congress is not being able to agree on this, even though it's a clear and present threat. I think you can make that argument, and it's slated to expire again September 30th of this coming year. The DoD authorization goes a few more years, but that'll have to be reauthorized as well. And the reason these aren't authorized permanently is because it's still an evolving area. People are trying to figure out how to do it, where you go. So how does the mitigation go? What could it conceivably be? You could jam, but we've already talked, there's ways that jamming may be impractical. You could detect it and move people to safety. That's a potential. You could detect it, and while you can't directly shoot it down, Although mitigation could conceivably use reason, those organizations could conceivably use reasonable force to do so in the statute, but you have to take the operational considerations, right? You don't shoot into a crowd of people, for example, to to mitigate it. So it becomes very complicated, just like dealing with a suicide bomber, right? If you make a mistake and you shoot the guy just because he happens to be wearing an oversized jacket because he's homeless, but he's not a suicide bomber, that's going to be a bad day for civil litigation, right? So you have to keep all those things in mind. So, what are the mitigation? Um, it's evolving. There's a series of gaps they need to be dealt with. There's an executive order that was just signed by the president of the United States to expand the ability to deal with drones and to look at what that future could be. There was one, Louisiana just enacted what they call the Louisiana We Will Act, or House Bill 261, which in Louisiana would give police officers the ability to neutralize, intercept, or disable drones through any legal and safe methods, including but not limited to jamming, hacking, or physical capture. The physical capture, like through a net, that's one way of mitigating. If you could actually get the net there or something like that. The question is that going to pass constitutional muster? Because there's already federal law there, and federal law prevails, right? It's illegal to do that. So
one friend of mine regarding that particular Louisiana law said one big issue is written as a way to challenge federal supremacy more than giving a real pathway for the police to actually do anything. It was more of like, that's kind of a, there. I think if I was writing a law, I'd probably couch it more in self-defense. Like people are allowed to defend themselves against drones, and then build it.
I don't know if you need to, and this is again, I'm not giving legal advice. I'm only a law student. I don't know if you have to enact that common law right of self-defense into law. It's well established. The question is it reasonable and necessary? And that's where the question is going to be, right? So, and there are, I don't think it will pass constitutional muster. I do think there are ways, and I don't think we're in the period of time of challenging federal supremacy is going to work, because then there tends to be an over securitization on dealing with these type of threats. And the securitization in the United States tends to be going counter to the 10th Amendment rather than enhancing the 10th Amendment, right? And where that goes, I don't know. But that's a problematic state of the law. I think the real danger in addressing laws, and there was a paper at Lawfire, it was a Duke University legal, blog, if you would, that basically argues that the real danger in dealing with the issue of drones is not the counter UAS technology gap, it's the constitutional confusion over how you do this, because right now only a small number of federal agencies have the authority, the four and their components, and local, state, and federal agencies don't. Now, if you look at just one metric, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department has more sworn police to deal with the Los Angeles County than the FBI has to deal with the entire planet. Right? I mean, so, and I'm not critical of the FBI. I mean, they're great investigators. I've worked with them and would continue to do so always. But we're talking about just sheer
capacity.
Capacity isn't there. There's legal ambiguity. That's where there's a lacuna that needs to be dealt with. So what do you do to deal with that? I mean, you start to keep in mind that there's going to be swarms and swarming attacks. You talk about, you don't need to weaponize a drone to be able to disseminate chemical and biological material, because there are agricultural drones that are high capacity that are used for crop dusting. You just go buy one of those. We can go buy a drone for around $5,000 that can swim underwater, swim on the surface, walk on the ground, and fly in the air. It doesn't come weaponized, but you could probably bolt that on. There's integration of AI. AI is going fast. It's somewhat unregulated. It's not as powerful as people think. but it's also unpredictable, in many ways. Enhanced first person view, that's going to come, but that's more of a battlefield thing than an urban city thing. Um, I think the heterogeneous drone swarm is a plausible future scenario. I don't think most terrorist groups have the organizational capacity to do that right now. Even if they could technically get one up, they don't necessarily have the ability to do that. But there's a whole range of converging threats. So how do you go? And how do you represent good data? Now, I think the interesting thing, I'll come back to the Caracas drone thing. I just kind of looked up where we're going. They didn't actually, those drones detonated, and it's not clear from the publicly available information how they detonated. They may have detonated prematurely. I don't know if they were mitigated, and there are some people who think it was a false flag attack, and I wouldn't rule that out with any group because disinformation is part of it.
Especially
So,
Maduro.
well,
he's a little of a showman.
he's not exactly a plain dealer, right? So I think there's a lot of still ambiguity there, other than it shows that you have the capacity to do that.
What do you think? This is maybe a little bit of a because I know you're very strategic and you have a very good, way of seeing coming threats and things like that. One kind of bigger concern for folks in the drone space is that there's two sides of drones, right? There's the positive use case for drones. And we talk a lot with the police, even with the Texas has a massive drone as first responder program. They've been doing some great work, across the whole country. Police forces, fire departments, medical folks have been using drones to really save lives. You're starting to see drone delivery becoming more common. I just saw Walmart, pass a couple 100,000 deliveries now of, goods. I think they're mainly in Arkansas right now, but they're starting to do drone delivery. I was talking with somebody who was giving me some stats on organ transplants and how a lot of organs actually essentially expire or lose their effectiveness after a certain period of time, and some huge number of them actually never get used because they're not able to get them to the person who needs it quick enough. But with drones, they've been able to utilize drop that number of organs expiring significantly to where might have been I don't know, remember the stat offhand, but let's say it was 60% were expiring and 40% were being used, to 70% could be used when they were utilizing drones to rapidly transport them to the hospital where that transplant needed to happen. So you're starting to see the real sweep in these really great positive uses for drones. But on the other side of that, this conversation's really focused on has been the negative use cases with the cartels. From that strategic place that you're sitting, do you see a place that maybe there's let's call it the 9/11 style drone event where there's a catastrophic terrorist attack using drones? Could there be a situation where the public kind of really turns on drone uses and it just gets generally outlawed? Or do you think that they're too integrated into our economic system for that to happen?
That's a great question. And I think, again, my crystal ball is not good. When I used to do intelligence stuff, I used to keep a magic 8-ball in my desk drawer. My boss would come and ask me questions like that. I pull it out and shake it, and then he'd tell me to stop that. And I'm like, look, I'm just fooling. Let me tell you how we could think about it. Drones have a great potential to do good. They call it drones for good. There are a lot of drone responder organizations. I was flying drones in the 1990s, the late 1990s, to do CBRN recon. And we were testing them. We put together, when I talk about the Terrorism Early Warning Group, we put together a forensic intelligence support component to actually go out and do recon for CBRN events. And we were experimenting with environment fixed wing drones to be able to get out there to do sensing. So there's great ability to sense for chemical, biological, radiological material using drones without having to expose people. If you, just like you use a bomb robot to go in and deal with unexploded ordnance and keep the bomb technicians safe, drones can be used to do that. In fact, the city of Beverly Hills in California is one of the early adopters on using drones for police response. The other city that was an early adopter was Escondido in San Diego County. They were looking at drones very early on. Drones can get in there and give you an ability to see, and the most important thing during disasters is to see and know what's happening. There was a large earthquake in Los Angeles, for example, and roadways fail and break. And I remember, working intelligence of, situation status during the Northridge earthquake in '94, and the freeway overpasses go down, and the San Francisco Valley, and the Castaic and those areas up there get separated from the rest of the county. How do you get there, right? And we started talking about do we move some assets, because we will have centralized command posts, for most of the public safety agencies down in the LA basin. Do we move some up into the North County, right? So drones are a way to get out there and see, get you a feel. If there's a bank robbery now and you have armed active shooters, or at a school, sending a drone in may be a very good way to get that understanding how many suspects you're up against, so you can put together a hasty response plan. So drones are there. Can you use it to transport material into people, for disaster response? Absolutely. Can you use it to, even disaster response stuff? You use drones for inspecting pipelines, right?
Power grids.
Power grids, So those are not going to go away. When you talk about those underground inspection stuff, I talk about the threat side of, uncrewed, subsurface vessels. Well, if you want to inspect, communication lines, right? That's a great way to look at those. I mean, so drones aren't going to go away. They're going to be integrated into our economy in great, powerful ways. Just like AI. AI has great danger. AI could be used, potentially as a weapon of mass destruction or disruption. However, when Nobel created dynamite, dynamite's used for legitimate purposes too, right? Building demolitions and, mining, so, I mean, it's not going to go away, but the regulatory framework is going to become more complicated. Like, how do we deal with drones in warfare? There's still some unknown area there. When we start adding AI to that, and things can, lethal autonomous weapon systems, they call them laws. There's no legal regime for dealing with that yet. The technology is moving faster than the regime allows. Now, we have rules in the U.S. Department of Defense on how you can integrate new technology, and you have to go through steps. Well, guess what? Our terrorist adversaries don't care. They're going to use this stuff. They're going to blow it up and see what happens, and they're going to figure out what works. So it's going to be a mix. Are we going to shoot them drones down? No, that's foolhardy. That's dangerous. Just because you have the capacity to do so doesn't mean it's going to be lawful or productive to do so. But as you mentioned, there may certainly be times when it's the right answer. But to get to that right answer, you have to train people with a legal foundation, move them through. So there's a lot of work to be done to integrate this. And it's going to be because we have a distributed federal republic, and notwithstanding the desire to consolidate some power at the federal level, which has been growing over time, and is growing, in front of us right now, the bulk of the police capability and public safety capability and response capability is not federal. And, the bulk of the police are, state and local. There is no federal fire department, right?
Yeah.
The bulk of fire departments in the United States are some combination of volunteer and paid call firefighters. In large metropolitan areas have, full service paid firefighters. You have our healthcare system is, and ambulance services are a mix of public, private, volunteer. Hospitals are, increasingly corporate entities merging and moving, yet they're going to use these technologies, to extend their capability, right? So this is part of the evolving world. We have to evolve it together and come up with sound security practices to do so, to protect critical infrastructure. And it's a converse strange thing, and this is not just to the United States. There's a shift in how governance is occurring. There's a consolidation of some powers. Some would say there's an authoritarian risk, and I think that is a reasonable interpretation in part. At the same time, there's a devolution of some powers, like let's get rid of FEMA. Well, I personally think that's a bad idea. And it seems like that ebb and flow. There's a belief, well, let's give that authority down to the states. But, if you give some to the states and pull some to the feds, you still have this need, either way, to balance how you actually provide service in a crisis.
Yeah, the one thing if you're starting to look at some of the laws and stuff being considered, it seems like the legislators are kind of starting to listen a little bit to the drone community, and that there needs to be some more engagement with the police, allowing them to have some mitigation authority. There needs to be a way to have, no-fly zones over critical infrastructure. So if there is a bad actor flying into a substation for a power plant, that they're violating the law, and then there's a little bit more wiggle room there for mitigation. It seems like, though, even with the authority to mitigate that some of those agencies have, it's been relatively limited the amount of drones that have been taken down. So I think there needs to be some of that case law before there can really be a large adoption. Someone's going to have the first one to test the law.
Well, no, you're right. People don't like to test the law. Sometimes you have to test the law. Usually a crisis will force you. The question is that crisis response appropriate? Even if the law says you can, does that mean that's the best thing to do?
Yeah.
If you have to have the law, you have to have the capacity, right? So say the 4 federal departments that have the authority to do so now, do they have enough coverage to get to every place in the United States? Now, certainly during a national special security event, which in advance is coming, you're going to ramp people up. Well, guess what? And those are high-risk things. They're visible. And have those been attacked in the history of man? Of course. The 72 Olympic attack in Munich is probably the reason I got interested in doing counterterrorism, to tell you the truth, right? That's a generation ago, and but there's going to be more modern views of that. But those are exceptions because of that, we know when those events occur, they come with a very big security package. There's intelligence sharing. And when the World Cup comes, we were talking about FIFA beforehand. Well, I worked on the FIFA the last time in the '94 finals in LA, and it was one of my first evolutions in public order intelligence, the Emergency Operations Bureau. We talked to cops all over the world to see who was coming, and we talked to the federal agencies, and we coordinated that. Moving to the future, I ran the intelligence integration stuff for the DNC in 2000 in LA. So the FBI and the Secret Service and a whole range of capabilities came together. I was testing the use of large-scale predator drones to do urban surveillance over LA. We never went and did that because they're very costly, but we looked to see are they technically feasible, and it is if you could have somebody who could pay the bill, right? So will we do that experimentation to figure that and fine-tune that? Yeah. Will the authority necessarily have to devolve under certain sets of circumstances to local authorities? Yes, but not to every single cop. Because when you give authority, you have to train people how to use that authority. You have to, your legal foundation, you have to have the training to do so, and it's not a one-off training thing. And then you have to bring the technical integration of what do those sensors do? Can you sense it? Well, there's no silver bullet. There's no one sensor thing that can sense everything.
It's layer detection, right?
Yes. It's like defense in depth, right? And do you have to push it out to an edge device? Is that secure? Will there be combinations of disinformation, and actual attacks occurring in real time? Probably. What does that look like exactly? I don't know. But some types of terrorist groups prefer multiple simultaneous attacks. Al Qaeda, during a period of their operational, life, had that predilection. Um, did that last? No, because their capacity to do so got degraded because we counter it, right? So it's going to be a lot of interaction. I think there's a lot of room to have lessons learned to learn how to do this. I would say we need to do a whole lot of red teaming to understand how to do this better. Do wargaming, red teaming, and do it, not just it's a threat, but it's a threat. It's a tool, right? It's a tool for the bad guy. It's a tool for us. It's a part of the kit that we both have. How do you interact those? How do you use them appropriately? How do you use them lawfully? How do you train decision makers at different levels how to do it? And how do you distribute that? See, and one of the things I look at is, because like we talked earlier, I've been experimenting with how you use augmented reality, right? So we have AI is going to become a powerful tool. Right now it hallucinates. We don't know how it thinks, and we need to get better at how that works. And we'll do that through experimentation, wargaming, and building human agentic teams, which I think is probably where we'll have to go. I prefer having a human in the loop, because I can hold a human being responsible. When I was a serving deputy sheriff, a peace officer, if I messed up and I shot somebody inappropriately, I could be criminally prosecuted and civilly, have a legal action brought against me for a tort, right? And they could have both occur simultaneously. Well, guess what? That's a check on unbridled authority. If a foreign nation state violates the laws of war, violate international humanitarian law, you can prosecute, those that are party to the International Criminal Court, the person who did it. You can bring the nation to the International Court of Justice and get a settlement between the nations, right? And most nations all nations that have incorporated treaties that deal with these issues into their legal regime, because you can prosecute it in your own, what they call, municipal justice system, in your own national system, right? In fact, that's the preferred way the International Criminal Court works, with complementarity. The United States soldier creates a war crime, we prosecute him, right? And if we don't, we're not party to the International Criminal Court, but we're party to other international, treaty organizations. If we don't, then another nation conceivably can. The UN Security Council can conceivably authorize prosecution. Is that possible with the veto power of the Big Five? It depends, right? I mean, it's and I say it depends because the only way we're able to do the Korean War is because one of the Big Five stayed home that day. But there's a lot of work to be done. But I prefer human in the loop, which means
I think that's a good point. We are running up on the end of our time, but I think you made some really excellent points. I think broadly speaking, most of the conversations we have end with, really education is so important, not just for people who might be watching, but for lawmakers, for people on the ground, law enforcement. It just seems that there's a really significant education gap about what you can do, what are the ways to protect critical sites or critical events, like you're saying, stadiums or gatherings, or even protecting important individuals, like you're seeing with that assassination attempt with Maduro. So it kind of comes down to before we can really move the drone community forward, we really need to bridge that education gap at all levels of the decision makers, just like exactly like you were just saying.
No, I agree. I mean, I think the key issues, I'll sum it up, and then I'll make a pitch for the legal profession. We need threat awareness, especially for high-profile events. We need to understand how you can detect drones. We need to figure out what countermeasures are appropriate, and that's both technology. We need to have a range of protective postures, and that requires alternate course of action development. And sometimes it has to be really fast. Like if it's flying in now and I have, only a few minutes to figure it out, we need to train people locally to do that, because you can't send that off far away. You need policy, operations, training. And I think red teaming is a good way to deal with that, right? You need good intelligence for the strategic side. You have to foster decision-making. And because the law is critical, and, people are wary of having lawyers around, because
nobody wants to be the first one.
But I
It needs
think
something.
you have to have legal advice integrated
Yeah.
into your decision support team, right? The military does that. The military does not, you know, plan a mission for targeting without having a JAG, a member of the
Yeah.
JAG Corps, a Judge Advocate General, uh, sit there and talk it through. The FBI doesn't do major operations without conferring with an assistant U.S. attorney, and sometimes right up to, main justice. We shouldn't be shy of that. Now, obviously,
Yeah.
you need to train the line cop to have the highest level of legal training they can, and I personally think we don't give them enough. I, go to law school. I realize I was a cop for 40 years. I go to law school for a year. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know that. And then you realize, but if I did know that, I would be a better cop. Right?
Yeah.
So you need to train people, exercise them in multidisciplinary teams, because this is a team and leader approach. And some of that's remote support, virtual reach back, but you don't want the guy who's walking in to the school at Uvalde, for example, and that's a true tragedy. You don't want him waiting for somebody offline to tell him, yeah, do this. You want to train the person who's going to make that decisive act to intervene the highest level possible so they can do that. And when you have time for multiple simultaneous events, have the reach back to go off and the strategic approach. So you need to balance them. It can't all be, give it to the strategic decision maker, and you can't give it all to the line cop, to go out and act. You need to balance the two. And that takes a lot of work. And that,
Yeah.
the one thing that I've often lamented, and I can't think of a police leader, manager, or cop in a radio car who didn't think that was, we need better support. We need better training. And it's not just money, although money doesn't hurt you because it's money, but it's money to train, right? But we need to spend time to train. The military, tier one special operations units, they spend and this is just a wild approximation, about a third of their time training, a third of their time operating, and a third of their time, recovering. Cops spend 95% of their time operating, right? We need to get more, and we don't have the luxury to have as many cops as you do for the military because you need cops more often, right? But we need more time for cops to war game, red team, exercise and train, and do so in teams with the lawyers. Do so. I mean, cops, not all, but many cops are wary of lawyers. Well, you know what? You learn a lot by working with them. They need to work on this. You need to work together with the EMS and the fire service because
Yeah.
you want to prevent every attack. Experience tells me you can't. So when you can't prevent, you have to mitigate that by having an improved response, which actually has a deterrent effect against the bad guy, because then they're like, well, that didn't work.
Yeah.
So you have to integrate those, but it takes a lot of funding, a lot of commitment, a lot of training of not only the cops, and obviously you need to train the lawyers on the legal perspectives, because otherwise they think, they have not a lot of time, but more time than a cop does to make their decision with a whole bunch of reference material that a cop, there's no conceivable way you could integrate that, although AI may help both professions. But you need to get people to know how to work together as part of a team, and you need to train the decision makers and the legislators that make the rules to know what the operational needs really are. And
I think that's right on. I think we're running a little bit over now, but no, I think that's a really good place to land the plane. And like you said, just training and education is important. I think, like I said earlier, every conversation kind of ultimately comes back to that need for all levels, like you said, from the cops on the ground to the legislators. Just people need to be aware of what they're doing and what options they have and what they can legally actually do, so you don't have some cop taking a shotgun out and starting to take pot shots at drones.
yeah, which is a really bad idea. But also, technology is evolving, and we're going to build countermeasures. And there's going to be technologies coming to sell everybody technology, and we need to have the technologists develop technology that we can actually use in our operational environment. at our level of training and understanding, right? And integrate. One of the things, I ran the law enforcement mutual aid program for the sheriff in LA for a number of years. And whenever there'd be a large scale event, you call in other agencies. Well, they don't come with your comm system. They don't come with your protocols necessarily. They come with theirs.
Yeah.
And then the next thing, first thing you do at the beginning of every evolution is try to wicker them together, make all of our stuff work. By the end of the event, everything moves smooth. Then you break it down and then it goes away and then you bring it back next time. Now, after the Oakland fires, and they created the standardized emergency management system and started realizing at least we needed all the fire hydrant couples in California to be the same, so they could, when an engine company rolled up, they could hook up their hoses, and that maybe we need to speak the same terminology. And now we have the National Incident, management system that takes that SEMS concept nationally. But that only works if you train at it every day, you work at it. And when the technology comes, it meets not only technological perfection, but it meets operational reality. And we got to do that too. So it's all big collaborative effort on how you bring people together to understand the threat, understand the threat evolves and matures, understands our adversaries learn as fast or sometimes faster than we do. And then get a real, ground truth, understanding where it is and work together to solve it,
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right on. But all right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. I think that was a good place to, a good perspective. And definitely tune in on Thursday. David is going to be having his show, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week.